the occupation of the favelas by the military. And the military shot 80 times into his vehicle as he was going to this baby shower because they thought he was a criminal. They thought they were looking for this criminal. And his young son witnessed that shooting. So this is in the favelas. This is the kind of racialized trauma and violence that is experienced in some of the most segregated neighborhoods in Brazil. So put on top of that infrastructure issues, put on top of that inequalities in food access, et cetera, and what you get is a milieu of social and economic and violent conditions that can become embodied and show up in health outcomes across this group. And so that's what led me to do this work, right? To begin to look at residential segregation, race, and I know, cardiometabolic risk factors seems really bland and boring. But again, I argue that these are the insidious ways, right, in which structural racism becomes embodied and it shows up. So when we look at stroke mortality rates, right, for example, in Brazil, for men it's a 43% higher risk of death, and for women it's a 76% higher risk of death compared to whites in that context, right? And so again, structural racism shows up in these data. And so what we did, I used data from the Brazilian longitudinal study of adult health, which is a longitudinal study based across 6 sites in Brazil, 6 cities in Brazil. They collected their baseline wave in 2008, and they've actually now collected up to 3 waves of data, which is really nice. They actually have a really nice racial heterogeneity in the sample. It's actually the largest sample in a Latin American country for a cohort study, about 15,000 civil servants. And for a researcher like me who likes to do work on neighborhoods and segregation and health, 98% of the participants were geocoded. So we're able to really link this kind of demographic data with the rich biological data that was collected in the study sites. When we measured segregation, we used data from the 2010 census, and I've been taking advantage of actually a spatial technique that is typically used in hotspot analysis. So the Gettysburg local G statistic is a hotspot analysis statistic, but we've used it for both racial and economic segregation in order to kind of capture localized segregation. So a lot of the segregation measures that we have are things like the dissimilarity index, but that's measured at the city level. And so we're not able to kind of look at these local processes and how this might be playing out. And so what this measure does, what I like about it is that it has 3 components that I think are really important. One, you get a sense of kind of the metropolitan level mean. So you're able to get the mean proportion of whatever attribute you're looking at, so percent Black or percent poor, et cetera. Then you have a deviation of whatever your census tract is from that mean, right? And so you're able to kind of look at that comparison. And then finally, it's weighted by other census tracts that are around it. So you're able to capture kind of the spatial and the clustering aspect of segregation with this particular measure. And what it returns is actually a Z-score. And that Z-score then you can put on a continuum of high versus low levels of segregation. And so this is a map of one of the cities in Brazil that we look at, Belo Horizonte in Minas Gerais. And what you see, the colors aren't as distinct, but this green area would be, these brown areas would be high levels of segregation. And what you'll notice in Brazil is that the spatial phenomenon of segregation is kind of flipped. So in the United States, we have the center core that's usually highly segregated. In Brazil, it's opposite, and it's the peripheries. And they actually call the suburbs, right, are the poorer areas. Although that's changing here in the United States as gentrification is happening, et cetera. But you see this kind of spatial kind of layout that really mirrors this, and this is the pattern that is kind of mirrored across the 6 sites. We also see again this residential segregation, the distribution differing by race. So for Blacks, Browns, and Whites, we see this that Blacks are more likely to live in highly segregated neighborhoods in our sample of civil servants. And then we also see something else that's interesting. So this is back to a map of all of Brazil, and I just want to orient you to show you the next set of data. So this dot density map of race what you see in Brazil is that in the south of Brazil is very white. In the northeast of Brazil is higher concentrations of Black. So I was interested to look at how our residential segregation score operated in different parts of the country. And so what we found is when we looked at Bahia, for example, and the distribution of segregation across Black, brown, and white racial categories, and again, this is a place where it's 20% white, 80% Black, the brown category, or the mixed race category, is more distinct from Blacks in that context, right? And so the distribution kind of takes this kind of stepwise gradient when we look at the residential segregation. But when we look at the south of Brazil, in Rio Sul, this is in Porto Alegre, what we see are that browns and Black become more similar in that racialized context where it's 80% white. And again, it shows how race can literally change kind of that interpretation and kind of your proximity to whiteness, right? Can give you or afford you different advantages in different contexts. Again, and this really underscores this idea that race is a social construct because it can change depending on the geography in which you are living in. And so to break this down, like we have to again think about the ways in which we've created kind of race and what that means in terms of our interpretation of this construct. But I thought that was really interesting that it played out in the data in this way. So then we also looked at cross-classified categories of residential segregation and race. And again, we see this gradient across both race and where people live. If we look at diabetes, a very similar gradient across racial categories and across where people live. And then when we look at our models, what we see is a 26% increased risk of hypertension and a 50% increased risk of diabetes compared in these two settings from high categories of segregation to with the reference of low categories of segregation. We're also beginning to do work in obesity. We've got work that we're looking at obesity prevalence, but we're also looking at waist circumference in order to kind of measure visceral adiposity. And again, we're seeing very similar patterns of prevalence of obesity, visceral adiposity, whichever one you look. But again, for obesity, it's only for women. And again, this is a pattern that we see across studies, across different countries, where the impact of segregation is more striking for women than it is for men. And so we're thinking about interpreting this data using an intersectional lens and intersectional framework. So what are the kind of key implications kind of backing up? One, that residential segregation is very important when we think about structural determinants and structural drivers of cardiometabolic risk factors, both in the United States and Brazil, and that the systematic and disproportionate exposure of Blacks to segregated neighborhoods represents a form of structural racism that can create and perpetuate racial health inequalities, again, in both of these contexts. And then as we think about policies, I'm beginning to think about this in a more, thinking about, the need to understand structural racism as we're thinking about policies. So a lot of our neighborhood policies have been, let's improve the neighborhoods. But as we've improved neighborhoods, we've actually fostered gentrification, which is a byproduct of structural racism. So if you don't, really get at the structural racism piece and policies and put policies in place that not only improve neighborhoods but prevent displacement, we can actually recreate the vicious cycle of structural racism where the very people that need to be benefiting from these policies actually do not, right? And so I think we need to be a little bit more nuanced, especially in public health, as we think about what we do about segregation and what we do about the neighborhoods that have been disinvested for years, and how we actually implement policies that are going to have the desired changes in those communities. And I'm still thinking through that because it seems like every time you try something, because of the way racism operates, it reinvents itself, it recreates itself. So how do we do this in a society in which that system is so deeply entrenched? And then I'm going to just kind of leave on a very high note, well, not really high, but a much broader note besides running regression models and running, getting p-values and confidence intervals. And really kind of just talk to you about what I think we need in this moment, especially as we're having these conversations around structural racism. So some of you all know this story because you've heard me give this talk before. But last year in March of 2018, I was in Rio for teaching and for research. And as a part of my training here at the School of Public Health, I was doing all this data analysis, I was going, kind of seeing visually how this manifested, but I had not yet been able to really talk to people most impacted by these conditions, right? And so one of the lessons I learned here at UNC is that you need to go talk to the people. Like you can't just stay in the ivory tower, you can't just stay behind your computer, you need to, be in community or talk to the people who are actually not only impacted by these issues, but also are doing things and are the change agents in their community. And so I, at the suggestion of one of my colleagues, went to an event called Young Black Women Moving Power Structures. It was part of a 21 Days Against Racism campaign that they have every year in Brazil. And I was going there to meet other kind of local activists who do work on structural racism, but most importantly to meet Marielle Franco, who was a local city councilor, Afro-Brazilian woman, born and raised in a favela, in one of the most segregated neighborhoods. But she was queer, she was Black, she was poor from the favelas, but she had risen in terms of her human rights activism and her political power to really begin to make some of the fundamental changes in the communities that she grew up in. And so she was pushing for policies and calling out kind of police brutality and using her platform as a local politician to advance what is needed in these communities. And so the night had been really powerful. It was about 40 or 50 Black women from all over Rio. She was on a panel. She had kind of organized a panel. And I kind of went up to Marielle and introduced myself. And, we joked about our curly hair. And we talked about kind of her. She was going to be coming to Harvard to a conference. And I just really embraced her as someone who is really just, doing this work. And in the struggle for human rights and social justice. And amplifying and making the invisible visible to so many of the power structures in Brazil that would render marginalized communities invisible, right? And so she was bringing voice, and really not bringing voice, but kind of amplifying voice in her role. So had a really awesome, phenomenal time with her and other women there, and left the event, was really excited that I had gone. And within an hour or two of leaving, found out that she had been politically assassinated after leaving this event. And to say the least, that experience shook me to my core. It awakened in me an urgency to this work that must go beyond the data and really get us to think about how we reframe the narrative around structural racism, because we have to insert it into our dialogue. But not only that, how we leverage data and mobilize data for action, right? She was trained in sociology. She had a master's degree. She had written, she had used data. She used data to kind of justify her points, but she took that data out of the ivory tower and she took it to the streets, right? And she mobilized that data in order to produce action. And so as epidemiologists, as folks who are concerned about these broader structural issues that we have to tackle, we've been doing health disparities work for 30 plus years, and I know because I was born the year the Heckler report was put out. 35 years we've been saying health disparities, black-white differences, and none of the gaps have changed. And we've also centralized the United States context, and in Brazil those gaps are also there. And so what are we actually doing? How are we actually mobilizing data, and how are we actually using it to dismantle the structures of racism that are impacting our communities? And so this experience, again, has been transformative. It was tragic, but yet it also awakened in me and awakened in others that I've met since then, this need to really push the envelope. Because we are living in very unconventional times. And the times in which we live call for something different. And so how can we as scholars use our work to amplify these issues, but also to be change agents in our communities and in the world? And so those final points, we gotta challenge the mainstream narratives. It's not just health disparities. We gotta push the envelope and talk about racism and be very explicit in that. We have to produce vigorous research and evidence, right? And so yes, let's do, have all the theory, have all the methods, have that rigorous evidence, and to make the invisible visible, but then we gotta mobilize that work, right? Can't keep it in journal articles, can't just keep it, help us to get promoted and tenured, right? What are we doing to actually make the changes necessary in our communities, right? Because literally, it's a matter of life and death. And way too many people are dying for us to just sit here and be comfortable and not do the work we know that needs to be done. On that note, thank you.
We have time for some questions if you want to ask. Go ahead, God, I'll let you.
That was amazing. I'm always so
Can you speak up
inspired
just a
to
little?
see your work. My question is, so I recently was listening to Malcolm Gladwell's revisionist history, and he was talking about Brown versus Board of Education, and his emphasis was on the fact that that ruling, which seemed to ostensibly do well, like force the integration of schools, actually had a negative impact on the schools that were mostly Black and doing very well at the time. And so I'm wondering how that sort of sits with this larger framework of segregation and what integration actually means.
Right.